We have one last speaker who many of you know and who we turn to for so many questions and guidance for his research and all the wonderful work that he does. And of course, that is Dr. James Ha. And as because many of you know him, I'll just briefly say he is the rock star in the animal research world, and we love having him as one of our experts to go to for animal behavior questions and just all kinds of research questions. So please read his bio for more information, but I don't want to take another second up. Welcome, Dr. Ha. We're thrilled that you could be with us and take it away.
Thank you for the invitation to speak again. Many of you have heard some of my presentations before, and there will be some overlap every year. I overlap a little bit of what I think is the most important information, but some new stuff too. So I've got the screen share up there, and hopefully you can see my presentation. Are we all set, Marcy?
Beautiful. It looks beautiful. Yes.
All right. All righty. All right. Well, yes. Thank you very much. For those of you who have not met me before, I am an emeritus research professor at the University of Washington. There's some biographical materials I think you guys have. I'm also a certified applied animal behaviorist, one of about 22 or 23, I think, in the United States at the PhD level. We have quite a few more associate CAABs, but this is sort of the highest level of certification in canine science and applied animal behavior in the country. So today, as I've done in the past, I want to talk a little bit about stress in working dogs. This is a bit of a passion of mine, a concern of mine. This is something that I think on a very broad sense across the board, not necessarily ADW people who are very well educated, but across the board, I think we need to do a better job in dealing with stress in our working dogs, probably also in our handlers, but I'm the dog behaviorist, so we'll talk about the working dogs. But there's been some interesting new science on this. And what it really does, I think, is it backs up exactly what we've learned in working with assistance dogs and how we have organically grown the systems that we use to develop and train handlers and so on. So I wanted to bring some of that new science to you and then share some, I think, some valuable lessons that we've learned over the years about dealing with stress in working dogs. And it's a very real thing. So as most of you know, the demand for working dogs is always going up. We're finding new applications, new places where the working dog and handler team are very valuable. And so the demand for working dogs is always up. My concern is that we went through a really big growth period in developing working dogs, and that a lot of working dogs, and especially these courthouse facility dogs, are beginning to age. And I've talked about aging and end of career decisions and things like that in some previous presentations I've done. Stress is a common cause of a shortened career because of its health issues and concerns about welfare. As I mentioned before, and this continues to be a new emphasis in a lot of welfare groups, they're beginning to turn from other aspects of animal welfare to working dogs and saying, well, are we taking care of these working dogs? Is this stressful to the dogs? What's the welfare like in working dogs? And I use that working dog term very broadly. This is something I'm dealing with in detection dogs and police dogs and military dogs and all kinds of other groups as well. I think what we need to do to improve the welfare or make sure we're maintaining the welfare of these dogs is education, education, education. And that's why I'm always happy to do these sorts of presentations. I've developed an education program in applied animal behavior, mostly dog behavior, through the University of Washington. Just trying to get the word out, trying to get better education out to groups that are involved with these working dogs. We are developing new guidelines and policies all the time. The federal government, the Justice Department is developing policies. Private groups are developing policies. And so I think there's an aspect that we need to jump into in terms of self-policing some of these guidelines and policies and so on. ADW has been one of the groups that's been at the forefront of this, and I think done a very good job of this. And one of the reasons that I'm very excited to work with the group. So that's a little rationale. Why do we care about stress? And here's the new stuff. I've talked about stress in terms of a bad thing. And I've always started off those presentations where I'm concerned, are we detecting stress in our dogs? What stressors do we have in our dogs, and how is it affecting their health and psychological well-being? But I've always said, and I've always started out with this statement, that not all stress is negative. Okay, stress per se is not the problem. And now we know that, in fact, in the correct forms, in natural forms, stress is critical. Stress is important. We have to expose our dogs to stress. Now, what does all this mean? Well, stress is not only good, but it's necessary. And we just recently have had a number of research papers come out that make this point. And so a new perspective is coming out, a new point of view on stress is really developing. And so that's why, I try to be very careful about keeping you guys up to date on these things, because you'll hear a lot of people talking, a lot of these welfare groups, that working 8 hours a day is stressful for these dogs, or working multiple cases in one day is stressful for these dogs. And I've suggested this, and I've suggested this should be a matter of concern. So we get this sort of stress is negative, negative, negative kind of perspective, and it hasn't fit with what we know about how the brain develops and how stress is experienced in the animals. And now the science is coming through to give us a new perspective. So the new perspective is that stress is not only good, but absolutely necessary. So not just stress per se is not necessarily bad, but in fact, stress is good. And go further, stress is necessary. What do we mean by that? Well, let's talk about what stress is. Stress itself, stress is any outside pressure on an animal, on an organism, that forces the individual out of a stable internal state. So the perspective in this is that everyone, every animal, every organism attempts to maintain something called homeostasis, or a stable internal state. All systems running smoothly, all lights are green, everything is running calmly and smoothly. Stress is any outside pressure that introduces a perturbation to that stability, that pushes the individual out of that stable internal state. So the new perspective, and this comes from a matter of, which is sweeping through science, of looking at everything about animals and plants, but we're talking about animals from an evolutionary point of view. Now we're getting into medicine from an evolutionary point of view, and it's completely revolutionizing how we're thinking about diseases and pandemics and everything else. Now we're looking at veterinary medicine from an evolutionary point of view, and we're looking at stress from an evolutionary point of view. And what we're finding from the neuroscience is that stress and its response to stress, how the body responds to that pressure, that perturbation, that fact of being thrown out of its internal stability, actually improves the individual's survival ability. So how does that happen? Well, I'll give you an example. This just came out in Science Daily recently. And of course, I went to the original paper. This is just a summary of the paper, but this gives you an idea. What we're finding from the neuroscience is that mild stress, appropriate stress, but stress nonetheless. Brief anxiety, brief pressure, brief uncomfortableness, however you want to express it, or however we explain that, how we see this stress early in life permanently alters the brain pathways. Now, when you're raising dogs for ADW, when you're a puppy rearer for any of the assistance dogs organizations, there is a strict protocol about having the dog experience life in the first 2 years of life. While the brain is still going through its brain spurts and brain growth, you want that dog to experience elevators and airplanes and other dogs and other people and strangers and tall people and short people and loud noises and stressors, right? So we in the industry argued that by having this purpose-bred dog that you have from a very young age, and from a very young age as the brain is developing, exposing it to this, I think what we broadly call socialization, that it produced a different dog, that it produced a dog that was more successful as an assistance dog later in life. Well, now we know how. Now we know why. Now we have the science behind it. And so what this study shows, for example, and a number of other studies that are coming out at the same time, and these are studies both on humans as well as on dogs. What this study is showing is that mild stress early in life, what we would call socialization in the first year and a half or 2 years, permanently alters brain pathways. This particular study showed that individuals that experienced stress early in life had altered brain pathways and were less likely to experience depression later in life. These altered pathways support, and this is a new phrase certainly in the animal literature, this is a phrase that's taken from the psychology literature, human psychology literature, but this is supporting what we are now calling resilience later in life. And so this resilience is of resistance to severe stressors. So when I came into this business and began learning about the assistance dog world, and through people like Ellen and Celeste at the Courthouse Dogs Foundation, and Jill and Linda at ADW, and a number of other folks, I was amazed at the resilience of these assistance dogs. This was not normal. This was not something you see in pets. They could experience stressors, workloads, levels of emotionality in their humans, and so on, that you would never find in a pet. And it always fascinated me. And what it comes down to in the common usage is, oh, well, these are purpose-bred, so there's a genetic component to this, and they go through our socialization. They go through our puppy raising protocol. But for me as a scientist, it was always a matter of, okay, but what's really going on? And now we're getting a much better idea about what's really going on. So what this is really very strong support for puppy raiser protocols, and a much better understanding of exactly what those puppy raiser protocols are doing in the brain of growing puppies, and that it is a hardwiring situation, that it is the socialization and experience that puppies get, very appropriate levels, not extreme. This is not a dog that's been abandoned on the street and has to fight for its life. That's extreme stress. But appropriate levels of stress, supervised levels of stress, is actually rewiring the brain. And that's what I found most fascinating. And I think that's what I found most valuable to this whole new body of work that's come out in the past year or so. And it's relevant to ADW. Of course, the way this is also being applied, for those of you who have the handler side of things, the psychologist side of things, the counselor side of things, is that this is also, we're finding that this is a major effect in humans as well. So early, mildly stressful experiences alter brain pathways to provide later resilience. Now, this also tells us some things, or certainly provides some weight to decisions like, should we be custom purpose breeding these dogs and obtaining the dogs at weaning and beginning that experience, those mildly stressful experiences? What about taking dogs from shelters and training them to become assistance dogs, which, as we know, in general practice, has had limited success. Now we understand better why. I mean, it was, because of their early experience. They had a different early experience, of course, that's in general. But we now have a much better idea because most pet dogs are isolated at these early ages. The worst example of this now is the COVID dogs that are coming out of the whole COVID period, who were truly isolated as puppies. And oh yes, by the way, we're also having a massive epidemic of stress and anxiety issues in later life in dogs. It's an epidemic. We practitioners, clinical practitioners, have never seen so many cases of anxiety in adult dogs. And everybody asks, well, why is it? Well, there's many reasons, like there's massive inbreeding going on, changes in lifestyle, mismatches of lifestyle of the dog to the lifestyle of the human. But we've also always felt that there was some kind of component about early life and early life experiences. So this is a mechanism for positive early socialization effects in these assistance dogs. And this is something that, of course, pet dogs or shelter dogs or dogs that were picked up off the street and so on are not going to have. They will either be too protected, too isolated, and not have these early experiences, or they will have severe early experiences, highly stressful early experiences, which can snap the whole system in a whole different direction and not a good one. So that's the kind of idea that I wanted to get across to you guys today. Too much stress at early ages blows out the system and produces pathological effects. This comes back, and this is all starting to help us explain things like kennel dog syndrome and post-shelter traumatic disorder, a term that I've used to explain the very negative effects, stress effects on dogs that are kept in shelters or in kennels, puppy mill dogs that are maintained with very little socialization, very little exposure, very little early stressful experiences. And so it helps explain a lot of that, depending on the age of that negative experience. And these dogs are less able to cope with stress at later ages. So again, this is really changing our perspective. I've always said not all stress is negative, and stress per se is not the problem. It's too much stress throwing the system out of balance for too long. That's the problem. Stress per se is not a problem. Our working dogs frequently experience quite a bit of stress. But what we now know is that it appears that we have developed the systems to produce quite a bit of resilience to that stress. So it doesn't have negative effects. So what we're really concerned about is chronic stress. And in the interest of education, I want to go through and talk a little bit about issues with chronic stress and that chronic stress. The problems with chronic stress is it leads to anxiety, as well as medical issues and all sorts of other things. And a common consequence of anxiety is irritation and aggression. And I do occasionally hear about cases in working dogs where they begin getting very easily irritated, or they become even so mildly aggressive, which of course is not a good thing. And it's always a matter in these cases of coming in and taking a look at how stressed the animal is and how the animal is dealing with stress. Management of long-term stress. So let me just give some guidelines about management of long-term stress. General health is always important. Regular checkups are critical, particularly as our dogs age. You notice all of this applies to the handler as well, I guess, but again, I'll stick to the dogs. Care with major events. We're finding more and more evidence, as in humans, that major life events are major stressors and have major stress effects, produce strong perturbations in the stable system. And that is what we're concerned about. So one of the biggest of these is initial introduction to new environment, especially social changes. Dogs are, and particularly our dogs, are especially sensitive to social changes. So we need to be very cautious about any kind of introduction to a new environment, changing handlers, handlers changing their home environment. I used to argue that it really required 1 to 3 months for dogs to recover significantly, to return to normal homeostasis, to the normal stable system. I'm now recommending, based on the literature, new literature coming out, I'm now recommending flatly 3 months for major changes, like a change in handler or a change in home. That there should be, for instance, reduced workload or something like that. Accommodations made for up to 3 months after major changes in the dog's environment, and especially social environment. Workload. We need a lot more science on this, but what I'm arguing for, I've argued in the past, is that there be constant monitoring, whether that's by a well-trained handler, whether that's by an outside evaluator, but constant monitoring for situations where the dog is in repeated short-term stress. Repeated short-term stress becomes chronic stress. Be very proactive about enrichment, which is something that I promote very heavily, and we're going to talk again about, and control of the environment. And a third place, I think, the effects of early exposure and early experience. I've changed my guidelines for how much of an effect major events have. And the third piece that's just gaining more support in the science is control of the environment, and how important control over their environment is for these dogs. And again, this parallels with the humans exactly as well. So I talk a lot about behavior enrichment, and I'll define some of this stuff. The addition of species appropriate behaviors to the everyday life experience of your dog. So again, what we're looking for is species. Is the dog able to exhibit at times, not all the time, but at times, species appropriate behaviors? Another part of the definition of behavior enrichment is providing triggers and stimuli and opportunities for alternative and additional behaviors. So what we want to do is we want to see a psychologically healthy animal should be exhibiting species appropriate behaviors on a frequent basis. And so they obviously need to be under trained control and constraint and appropriate behavior in their working environment, but providing these opportunities for species appropriate behaviors later on is important. So I have some principles about this, and some of you have seen this before. The exhibition of species normal behaviors, letting dogs be dogs, and then again, I've emphasized allowing control of their environment. So let me give some examples. Species normal behaviors, exercise and play. And this is where exercise and play is where you can incorporate a lot of these other factors like species normal behaviors and control. Let the dog decide what the exercise is. to whatever degree you can. Let your dog decide what the play is. Let your dog decide how long to exercise. At times, I love to see dogs exercising until they quit, until they're exhausted, until they're bored, until they're done. So that's an important factor. And there's all kinds of ways of doing exercise and play with dogs, you know, from retrieving and frisbee to running. You know, it depends on the breed of dog and in your lifestyle. But there is no way to understate the importance of exercise and play, the freedom, the ability to make their own decisions, their control over that environment, in working, especially in working dogs.
Dr. Hall,
Yeah.
we have a question in the chat about what happens when we have a dog that just won't quit
What happens?
exercising, that is.
Does not quit.
Yeah, they just will
Yeah.
continue chasing a ball, swimming. Yeah.
Well, I'll say two things. One is, most of the time we have other things going on in life, and you only have so much time to play, and you have to cut it short. However, I will emphasize that the dog will quit. The dog will quit. The dog may just not quit as quickly as you're ready to quit. And so I encourage you to occasionally, when the opportunity is available, to see if you can find the quit point. Now, you may need to up the exercise. You may need to increase the distance that you're throwing. I have people who will tap out because the people can't keep going that long, but they'll tap out and let the partner, the spouse, whatever, and see if you can actually find the end. I rarely have ever had a dog that won't quit. It may take a long time. But this is the fact that they have done it to their satisfaction is a really important experience for the dog. So to whatever, I mean, you can't necessarily do this all the time or frequently, but even on a monthly basis, this can be very important. And this is exactly the same thing that we have found in humans as well. Just the ability at some point to experience that. And it may mean that you need to get, you know, I mean, we have people hire joggers, you know, if you're not a jogger, or be able to throw the ball even further, you know, with a throwing tool, or as I say, tap out and just keep going with somebody else, or and so on. So that's what I have to say. And when extreme efforts are taken, which you can't do all the time, but when extreme efforts are taken, you usually can find the end. In fact, I will say that I have never experienced a situation where we did not find the end, but it can certainly take longer than the human has the patience or stamina to do. So it takes some special arrangements. Food puzzles. I've talked a lot about food puzzles before. We have a lot of data on this. And so we know of the positive effects of food puzzles, of slowing down how fast dogs eat, of having them search for their food, and be able to work for their food. There's an effect called contra freeloading, in which we know that many dogs will actually choose to search for their food rather than take free food, just because they want the mental stimulation. And so feeding in a food puzzle, always recommended when appropriate. And this is some of my favorites. I've included the twist and treat, which is a favorite of mine. Here's an area that's expanding rapidly. This is an area that's really exploding. both in availability and familiarity to the public, but also in the scientific research, the value of scent work. And I'm using the term scent work in the broadest sense. There's a number of different ways to perform this. There are a number of different organizations that are promoting what I call scent work in the broadest sense. Nose work games is what one website here is calling it generically. You have to be careful because terms are getting trademarked and so on. Here's the AKC scent work program, training classes. This is just spreading like wildfire. And part of the reason it's spreading like wildfire is because it's so easy to do. You can set up a scent work program in your office. I have people who have scent work trails, if you want, courses set up in a courthouse. And it's a lot of fun and easy to set up and cheap to do and has incredibly positive effects on psychological well-being in your dogs.
Dr. Howe, we have
yeah.
a question
Yep.
about the food puzzle.
Yep.
We're wanting to know, how often should we mix it up? Does it matter if they're always eating out of the same slow feeder food puzzle?
It does. Novelty is one aspect of enrichment, is novelty. I generally don't encourage novelty in the food itself. Dogs can get guts, digestive systems can get very entrained to one food. Veterinarians have very specific ideas about proper food. So I love to see changing up even the food. There's a novelty once in a while, but that can backfire on you. So certainly I encourage different feeders. Yeah, I always have 2 or 3 or 4 different feeders for my dog. And you rotate them around, you change them out once a week, you know, whatever. But novelty in the environment is an important aspect to enrichment, and therefore, yeah, you want to change up the food puzzles. One of the things that in the scent work that's so nice is that you can change up the scents, and it's a entirely different project for the dog. So it's very easy to add novelty to, I mean, it's sort of built into scent work. You don't always use the same scent. And so it's very easy to add in that novelty. Go ahead.
We have another question that goes back to allowing dogs to exercise until they reach their limits.
Yeah.
They're wanting to know, are there any specific things we should be looking for to make sure they don't overdo it, like heat exhaustion, anything else we should be thinking of?
Yeah, and so before you develop this, let me go back to the very first prime thing, and that's general health. And if you're going to increase or try increasing the level of exercise and play, it is the same as with humans, right? You want to make sure that that's veterinarian approved. You want to make sure that you're getting regular checkups, and those regular checkups should always be with a good quality veterinarian. And as your dog ages, certainly beyond the age of at least 6, should always include an examination for arthritis or any other form of what I call musculoskeletal pain, hip dysplasia, arthritis, pinched nerves, and that should be part of an at least annual exam. And so you certainly want to get the veterinarian's clearance before, really altering levels of exercise. Of course, always take precautions. Plenty of water should always be available during exercise. Watch out for heat exhaustion in extreme situations. Most dogs are very resistant to that. And again, the dogs will tell you. I mean, when I'm saying that the dog is, you want to, get the dog almost to exhaustion, then what I mean is when the dog starts to slow down, when the dog becomes more reluctant to chase, in the 2 dogs that I've done this with, my own dogs, they will, they'll run back and stay on their feet and be ready to go again. When one of them runs back and lays down, I'm done. That's their signal that they're done. Now, if I throw that, they'll go again, but they will run back to me much slower. That's my signal they're done. If I throw it, they'll go again. So that's one thing you want to watch out for. So all we want is to have the dog acknowledging I'm tired. The dog acknowledging, okay, I'm getting there, right? That's all we need, because you can get a dog, and particularly our dogs with such a close association with their handlers, they will do what you tell them to do until they die. And so you really just want to get them to the point where they are slowing down or they are acting reluctant. And then, and then that's generally telling you that that's the point to stop. Is that it? Good to go, Marcy?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. So I really like the scent work. This is something that's really coming on strong. A lot more resources are available, and a great way to introduce opportunities for your dog to exhibit these species normal behaviors. Okay. The other point that I want to emphasize here is that importance of environmental control. And again, like the enrichment, like the opportunity to express species normal behaviors, the importance of the dogs having at times any form of control over their environment is very, very important. Okay, so when appropriate, let your dog make decisions. This can very often or have control over you as a handler. Free time walks, what I call sniffaris. With my dog, Franny, when we're working or we're in a restaurant or we're more likely in a bar or we're, in the store, I give her a command and she sticks to, she heels. She sticks to my side and we are moving, right? Not looking left and right and moving. But she knows that when I put on a different leash, it's her time. It's what we call the snuffari time. And you're following the dog within reason. Of course, there's safety. You're not following your dog with her head down straight into a major intersection or anything. But how long she stops to sniff, totally up to her. And my dog sniffs everything. It's only a walk up to the end of the street to the beach, and it can take half an hour to get up there. Because she has to sniff everything, and this is her control over the environment. Sometimes she wants to go straight up. Sometimes she's ready to. I mean, she just is on a tear, and she just trots right up the street. That's what she wants. That's what she gets. If she wants to stop and sniff every last rock the whole way up there, that's what she gets. And so, very good way for the environmental control. Off leash play if it's in a open area. In other words, trail hiking. I know Linda does this with her dogs. She has property nearby where you can take the dog off leash and just let them. And they stay close, and you call them back occasionally, but they get to decide, am I going off to the left, or am I going off to the right, or staying close to home, or whatever. Again, let the dog say stop is control over their environment. And the importance is allowing dogs to have some control over their social environment. And I think this is really critically important to healthy psychological well-being, particularly in our dogs who for 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, may be working in a very tightly controlled, restricted kind of environment. They need their refreshing, I'm in control, And I get to do some enrichment and do something else and do it under my control. So a couple take-home messages. Again, I always want to emphasize the importance of being aware of stress and in the fact that it's an important and it's not a simple issue. There's no simple solutions. And it's very individualized. So ask for help if you're concerned about welfare. If you ever see changes in behavior of your dog, reluctance of your dog to go to work or to perform a certain behavior, be careful to be sure to be sensitive to these warning signs and ask for advice from a behaviorist. Big lesson this time is experiencing limited stress at a young age is critical to resilience. And it just emphasizes the importance of these puppy raising programs and the dramatic effects that they're and lifelong effects that they're having, and the importance of enrichment and exercise and play and feeding and nose work, alternative sensory stimulation. There's lots of other games you can do a variety. You can do sounds and all sorts of things, but and allowing control of their environment. So those are sort of my take-home messages. And
we do have a question, another question for you, Dr.
okay,
Ha.
I'm done.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Okay, so
Let's take some
we'll
questions.
get to pick your brain. Okay, awesome. So one of the questions is, can you talk about or make any comments on the latest research that temperament is not related to breed?
Sure. That's ridiculous.
Okay.
I don't know if you need.
Okay.
That
Okay.
is not what you were reading. Is a summary, summaries, a variety of summaries from Science Digest science writers, who in this particular case, worse than even we've ever seen before, entirely misquoted and misunderstood the study. So if you read the original study that where all those news items came out, if you read carefully the original study, it is absolutely, positively not what the original study said. So those articles that all suggested that raised a huge flurry, were some of the worst science writing, science summary, paraphrasing science to the public we've ever seen. We see a lot of bad stuff in our business. This was one of the most blatant. Now, having said that, the paper that they were summarizing was not of high scientific quality, and their conclusions were phrased in a convoluted way, because of the way they conducted the research and so on. They were trying to draw conclusions and they were saying things in an interesting fashion, possibly leading to misinterpretation by science writers.
Okay. And this individual is also asking then, what is the reference of temperament to breed? They don't know the argument, and we're just curious about that.
What is the what?
The reference of temperament to breed.
I don't know exactly what you mean by that. There are numerous studies which have shown from the 1980s forward, which have shown that while there is always variability in temperament, that's what temperament is individual variability and behavior, that there is a strong genetic component to that temperament. Upwards of 50% of the variability in temperament is genetic. And therefore, there are characteristic average temperaments or typical temperaments for each breed, because a breed is obviously a concentrated collection of a certain combination of genes. and it makes them look like that and be that big, and and so on, and have that herding behavior, or have that predatory behavior, or have that. So it's exactly in line with that thought that, of course, they would also have a concentrated set of characteristic genes for a certain temperament. Having said that, temperament is highly variable and influenced by the environment, by the experience of the individual. So is there such a thing as breed typical, breed most common, breed typical temperament? Absolutely, yes. If you want a dog of a certain temperament, your best bet is to choose a breed most closely represented by that temperament. Notice how carefully I worded that. That does not guarantee that you're going to get a dog of that temperament. That's going to increase the chances that you're going to get a dog of that temperament. You may get a dog of a very different temperament, partly because 50% of the variability in temperament is due to life experience. And we just talked about, we're getting mechanisms about how life experience is affecting the brain. And so what the article was summarized to say flies in the face of a massive amount of other literature. And if you read carefully the paper itself, it turns out it's not really what they said.
And Dr. Hall, we also have a request. If you would please put the slide back up, that's the take home slide again, the takeaway. Thank you. Thank you. I think some people
No
want to make
problem.
sure that they got that.
Absolutely.
And then another question that we have is, can you provide some examples of appropriate levels of stress that were used for the study?
Okay, so what we want, what we're looking for, what they're doing in these studies and so on, is putting individuals, I think what we would say is putting individuals in uncomfortable situations. Okay, but with a couple of constraints. One is you put them into uncomfortable situations, but not situations in which they're completely breaking down. You're putting them into uncomfortable situations, but you're not doing it continuously or frequently. So that means that you're allowing recovery time in between. Now, if you put an animal or human into a very, I think in common terms, maybe very uncomfortable situation, a very stressful situation, it can take up to 48 to 72 hours to fully recover physiologically, biochemically, in the body, your brain, to fully recover and return to that internal balance. So what we're talking about, is the kind of things that we're doing with the puppy rearing, right? You're taking the puppy on an escalator, an elevator. That is stressful. They are showing signs of stress when you do that. Are you positively reinforcing it? Yes. Are you doing it over and over and over and over and over again all day long till they fall apart, till they refuse their treats, till they're so anxious that they refuse to do anything else? No. Are you doing it every 3 days or once a week? Yes. So we don't know exactly where the line is for any one individual. And of course, it's going to differ for any one individual. But what we're talking about in early life events, both in humans as well as in the dogs, is stressful events that clearly make you anxious, clearly get you upset, clearly throw you off your game if you want, for a brief period. Acute stress is not the issue. Chronic stress is the issue. Where we have concerns, for instance, if we want to flip this around, because we know that if you apply negative chronic stress, bad stress, long-term stress, let's say a dog in its first year and a half that lives in a kennel, that lives in a shelter, that lives in a puppy mill, that also permanently wires the brain, and not in a good way. Those animals become more likely to exhibit anxiety and depression later in life. And so what we're talking about in these cases is very limited, push them out of their bounds, let them come back. Push them out of their bounds, let them come back.
And that is one of our questions we just received, Dr. Ha, is can dogs come back from chronic stress at all?
Yes, some dogs can come back from chronic stress. And we've always wondered why some dogs can and some dogs can't. What we're learning, and this recent neuroscience stuff is helping us a lot with this, is it clearly depends on how severe that chronic stress was, the details of it, and again, how severe it is going to be in the eye of the person, the dog experiencing it. So a little bit of individual variability here, but how severe the chronic stress is and at what age it is. And we know that chronic or severe stressors at critical periods in the dog's development are negative. And so we have dogs as adults who have experienced this kind of street dogs, Costa Rican beach dogs fighting for their food as puppies, and so on. People adopt them. It is a battle. It is extremely difficult to get them to recover from that early negative, those early negative experiences. It appears to be, well, how wired, how much of an effect did this actually have on the brain, or how much of this is just a learned response and I can unlearn it, right? And we can unlearn things, but it's hard to change that wiring in the brain. And so it can be done. I have had a number of clinical cases in my practice where we've had that. I've had successes and I've had failures. I've had amazing successes. And failures. And it's a lot of work, which is the problem usually. Is the owner willing to put in the work? If you put in the work and have, willing to take upwards of 2 years, it can be done.
And there's a follow-up question about that. Is there any evidence that certain breeds handle stress better than others?
Good question. No. And I would say it's coming down to science. No, I don't think that's really been looked at. I think colloquially, we believe that certain personalities are more resilient. In fact, measuring resilience is now an aspect of measuring temperament. And so I think we have some breeds in which stronger resilience is common. Remember, we just talked about personality and breeds. So I think there are high resilience breeds, but remember I said personality varies within the breed. So, you're going to have individuals with extremely high resilience and you're going to have other individuals with very low resilience. And so I think this is a cutting edge question. I would say I don't have a good answer. I couldn't provide a list. I think this is going to be the direction that we're going in, though. Now we want to go back and look at this resilience and how much of this resilience really has to do with this early exposure, how much of this resilience really has to do with their genetic makeup and therefore breeds differences and so on.
Well, we have one final question, and that really leads into that is what other research do you know of that's being done around chronic stress, and what are you participating in? What work can we look forward to seeing coming from you in the coming months and years? Yeah, because it takes time.
Yeah, from me personally, you're going to be finding out about the chronic stress I'm going to be applying to the saltwater fishing in the Florida Keys. I am retiring. I've retired from my university position. I'm now emeritus. I'm doing a lot of teaching. But the two granddaughters just came along, And so doing research on chronic stress in dogs is taking a back seat to observing and participating in the early environmental experiences of granddaughters.
As it should, right?
That's
Yes.
right.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ha, as always. We always learn something. It's so informative, and you are always on the cutting edge. So, thank you so much for sharing this new research and valuable information. We greatly appreciate you and your innovative work. And you know how much we love Fanny and are so glad that
That's
she is
absolutely. Yep.
with you.
Yep. She was
Well,
just out fishing with me last night on the boat. So she's my
awesome.
fishing buddy. Yep.
Awesome. And just quickly, how can any of our participants, if they want to reach out to you, what is the best way to do that? By
You can always
email?
find, yeah, down at the bottom of the screen here, we've got drjimha.com. My contact information is up there. Email is the best way always to start off. I'm happy to, set up a phone call if anybody wants, some advice or anything like that. Happy to offer advice or perspective, about specific cases. I can't really comment on specific cases without, answering the specific questions and getting the background, but I'm always happy to provide advice to anybody associated with ADW. This is a resource I certainly can provide, contribute and help out. So you can always get my contact information there or at the University of Washington.
Thank you so much. And I just put that in the chat as well. So thank you, Dr. Ha. We greatly appreciate you.
Thank
Thank
you very
you.
much for the invitation. I always enjoy it.